me.
We can
Thank
hear
you.
Member Faringa.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on the Offshore Petroleum and Greenhouse Gas Storage Amendment, titles Administration and Other Measures Bill 2021 and the Regulatory Levies Amendment Bill 2021. These bills aim to change Australia's offshore oil and gas regulatory regime so that the inevitable decommissioning of oil rigs is managed and that the cost of the decommissioning do not land on the taxpayer. The decommissioning of wells will be a growing issue over the coming years. The industry has no problem putting rigs in the ocean, but has serious difficulties in decommissioning safely, at minimum cost, and taking responsibility for doing it. This is exacerbated by the industry struggling to find buyers for ageing assets, as more investors are now conscious of the risks, climate or otherwise, of taking on such assets. As Rystad Energy Report projects, that oil and gas wells waiting to be decommissioned will rise from 160 today to 440 by 2026. So this is clearly a growing problem. This will be the largest amount of decommissioning to take place we will have seen for decades. It's important that the costs of decommissioning are not heaped onto the taxpayer because the invoice and the cost will be substantial. The worst example is that of the Northern Endeavour. The facility is 274 metres long, located 550 kilometres northwest of Darwin in the Timor Sea. The owners of the facility, Northern Oil and Gas Australia, were placed into liquidation in February of last year. That has left the unprecedented clean-up cost on the taxpayer. It could run up to $1 billion. Decommissioning will take several years. And the taxpayer is footing the bill of $5 million a month just to maintain the facility. Wood & Mackenzie modelled that the Australian petroleum industry decommissioning liability, both onshore and offshore, will be more than 60 billion Australian dollars over the next 30 years. Now, with an Australian net debt approaching the $1 trillion, Australia needs to be absolutely cognizant more than ever of this cost, and we cannot put this on the tax. Unsurprisingly, there's been opposition to this measure, but it is absolutely one that has to occur. The bills will amend, from a technical point of view, the Offshore Petroleum and Greenhouse Storage Act 2006 to increase oversight of entities throughout the life of an offshore project. And the proposed regime is sensible and will ensure proponents manage the decommissioning and restore the environment. One of the more controversial parts of this legislation is the introduction of a trailing liability, whereby a former title holder can be liable for decommissioning. This measure is already used overseas, including in the UK, where massive decommissioning works are happening in the North Sea. Probably the most controversial part of this bill is a plan to introduce a levy on the industry. Ironic from a government that continually talks about not wanting to introduce taxes. But this is an exact point where a levy is incredibly important. In 2021-22 budget, the government announced there would be a temporary levy to offset the cost of decommissioning Northern Endeavour. This levy will be set at 38 cents per barrel, and it will cease when the Northern Endeavour has been decommissioned. And the levy is projected to raise $367 million per annum. And of course, the industry has issues with the levy, but it's well past time that actually oil companies started paying their way and the consequences of their business. So what I disagree with is that the nature of this levy be temporary. We know that there is much more decommissioning that will be necessary in the future. In fact, hundreds of wells will need to be remediated in the mid-2020s. And we know that many of these companies are probably going to fold as the world transitions to net zero emissions. So who's going to pick up the bill then? What assurances is the government providing to the Australian people? We need to preempt the inevitable decommissioning crisis by establishing a permanent decommissioning fund. We can't have this land on the taxpayer at a time where our national debt is already so high. So many speakers previously from the government have spoken about the great achievements by the Morrison government on emissions reduction and focus on carbon capture and storage, and of course always the focus on technology rather than taxes. Here, this is a clear point where this levy needs to be made permanent. We need to ensure we have a fund to deal with the issues of decommissioning in the future. This is something that needs to be maintained. This should not be a temporary measure. And I would say we need to go a step further. We actually need to place on the industry a national climate disaster levy to collect money from oil and gas companies that are contributing to climate change, which the taxpayer does pick up the bill. It is the taxpayer who is ultimately taxed for the cost of these disasters. Oil and gas companies should be on the hook for a lot of the consequences that they are causing. Too many corporations of these corporations don't even pay significant taxes in Australia. We know greenhouse gases are being released in the atmosphere are directly linked to the worsening extreme weather events that severely impact our economy, our communities, our health and our environment. Fossil fuels are the major contributing cause to increased gas emissions. And currently, it is the Australian taxpayer who pays in taxes or directly when disasters hit, and it is not the oil and gas majors. If we were to set a $1 per tonne of embodied carbon and oil and gas extracted from gas wells, this would raise money to meet considerably escalating costs of natural disaster. One estimate has natural disaster costs growing to almost $39 billion per annum to the economy over the next 30 years. Who is going to pay for that? The Black Summer bushfires were projected to have cost the Australian economy over $50 billion alone. The Australian public has been asked about this type of measure, a national disaster levy, and supports it. The Australian Institute 2020 Climate of the Nation report, the majority of Australians, some 65%, support a levy on fossil fuels to pay for climate disasters. It's time for oil and gas majors to pay for their fair share of cleanup of the climate mess and obviously the cleanup of decommissioning wells. So I support the bill, but I would say, ironically, the government is working against its own interests in respect to other decisions. Just on the 15th of June, recently, the federal government released a further 80,000 square kilometres of offshore petroleum exploration acreage. Some of that acreage is in prime tourism areas. For example, there is now acreage of just 6 kilometres away from the 12 Apostles near Port Campbell off the Victorian coast. It will be terrible for local economy, tourism, climate, the local environment if that acreage is developed. The International Energy Agency has said there can be no new fossil fuel developments from this year if we are to stay true to our commitment to the Paris Agreement to actually limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. We need to reach net zero prior to 2050, and that means no new acreage can be developed. Of course, the Minister for Energy, the Prime Minister will talk about preferably reaching net zero by 2050. But the reality is, and the spin of it's always about technology, not taxes, is absolutely empty and meaningless, because the reality is technology needs targets. You need targets and legislation to drive investment and uptake of technologies. We must double our targets to reduce emissions by, at the minimum, by 2030, and we must stop all new gas exploration and drilling. The push for gas is just a cynical short-term move by, I would argue, regional MPs who are trying to win votes on promises that these fossil fuel industries will be around forever. They will not. It is selling an empty promises to communities that do face a serious transition risk and are not being properly protected. We must abandon this folly, this short-sighted policy, and actually put in place plans to assist these communities. The gas folly that the government continues on is clear. Gas will not lower prices. We have tripled supply and gas prices have increased by 130%. Gas is not a transitional fuel, and it's disappointing to hear both sides of the political spectrum continually harp on like that when it's clearly not. Grid batteries outperform gas peakers on a cost by as much as 30% now. The market has spoken. It has invested over $4 billion in batteries just this year. We don't need more gas supply for domestic markets, as over 70% of our supply goes offshore anyway. There will not be a market for gas in 30 years, as most of our major trading partners have committed to and are putting in place plans to net zero targets by 2050 or 2060. So it's an entirely counterproductive measure. It is short-sighted, and continuing down this road just shows the political opportunism versus actual good planning. Now, the issue of gas platforms, offshore gas platforms, is very sensitive and hot in Warringah and off the coast, the east coast, from Newcastle to Manly. We have a significant uncertainty on the future of another fossil fuel project off the coast. The Petroleum Exploration Permit, PEP11, is a permit for exploring oil and gas that extends from Newcastle to Manly Beach. It is the most ludicrous project. Some areas of this permit are just 5 kilometres offshore. Bounty Oil and Gas NL and Asset Energy Proprietary Limited are the title holders, and they are intent on pressing ahead against the community's wishes, who overwhelmingly reject the proposal. It must not go ahead, and it would be a calamity for the environment, the local economy, the coastal region. I mean, it just defies common sense. The IEA has found that no new fossil projects should go ahead, so it's clear that these projects should be cancelled. PEP 11 expired in February this year, but the Minister continues to maintain that the fate of the program is undecided, and it's the Minister for Resources, the member for Hinkler, continues to threaten to extend this licence. It should be forthright with the community and end the uncertainty. It has already been rejected at state level, government level, and should also be done so at federal level. This bill before the House to force oil and gas producers to start paying their responsibility for decommissioning is important. Many of the measures in this bill are prudent, but what we need to see is permanent measures, a permanent levy in this respect. Decommissioning liabilities are likely to be north of $60 billion, and that cannot fall on the taxpayer. And it should not be a question of taxpayer bailouts to these companies. So it is clear that we need to make sure we have a permanent long-term fund to address these issues. We need to have a levy to address the growing cost of natural disasters. Many in the community agree with this. We absolutely need to move and make sure that we are properly, as a government, as a parliament, we all have a responsibility for the legacy this parliament will leave. And at the moment, it is a short-term policy. We absolutely need to stop increasing oil and gas exploration, acreage, and address all the transition aspects and decommissioning aspects that are coming. And finally, I would call again on the Minister to cancel the PEP 11 licence that it currently exists off the coast from Manly to Newcastle. Thank you.